The Stoic philosophy was founded by Zeno, a Phoenician c. 320 c. 250 BC. But nothing by him has come down to us except a few fragmentary quotations. He was followed by Cleanthes, then by Chrysippus, and still later by Panaetius and Posidonus. But though Chrysippus, for example, is said to have written 705 books, practically nothing is extant by any of these philosophers except in second-hand accounts. Only 3 of the ancient Stoics, Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius, survive in complete books. None of the 3 has ever had a large audience. The history of their reputations is curious. In the 17th century, Seneca was certainly the best known. Then, in the late 19th and early 20th century, he was almost completely forgotten, and popularity alternated between Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. Under the influence of Matthew Arnold, the latter became a sort of cultural must for mid-Victorians. As an example of what was being written in the early years of this century, I quote from one of the self-improvement books written by the novelist Arnold Bennett. I suppose there are some thousands of authors who have written with more or less sincerity on the management of the human machine, but the 2 which, for me, stand out easily above all the rest are Marcus Aurelius Antoninus and Epictetus. Aurelius is assuredly regarded as the greatest of writers in the human-machine school, and not to read him daily is considered by many to be a bad habit. As a confession, his work stands alone. But as a practical Bradshaw of existence, I would put the discourses of Epictetus before M. Aurelius. He is brimming over with actuality for readers of the year 1908. Nevertheless, Aurelius is of course to be read and reread continually. When you have gone through Epictetus, a single page or paragraph per day, well masticated and digested suffices. You can go through Monsieur Aurelius and then you can return to Epictetus and so on, morning by morning or night by night, till your life's end. 2 things are worth remarking about this passage. First, it presents both writers simply as guides to living. It nowhere mentions their Stoic philosophy or its implications. And second, it nowhere mentions Seneca. In this, it was typical not only of Arnold Bennett's own frequent references to the 2 later Stoics, but to the references of his contemporaries and those of other writers down to the present day. Yet Seneca was the first of the 3 great Stoic philosophers whose writings are still extant. He lived half a century before Epictetus, and more than a century before Marcus. His output was far greater than that of either of his successors, and he surpassed them in purely literary gifts. In his writings on philosophy, one memorable aphorism follows another. There are almost none of the obscurities that one so often encounters in Epictetus and Marcus. His long neglect seems all but unaccountable. It is the purpose of this volume to make available generous selections from all 3 of the great Stoic philosophers. So far as the editors know, this has not been done elsewhere. There are only 1 or 2 books that even bring reasonably adequate excerpts of Epictetus and Marcus together. Most often readers have had to find them in separate volumes. And adequate selections from Seneca's writings on Stoicism do not seem to exist in any book at present in print. Moreover, most readers today, we are convinced, will much prefer to read selections from each of the great Stoics rather than have to confront their output in its entirety. Because of the very way in which their work was composed or reported, it is full of repetitions. The Meditations of Marcus, for example, were apparently a journal, kept solely for his own eyes, in which he put down each evening or morning some reflection, resolve, or piece of advice to himself, without looking back to see whether he had written substantially the same thing a week or a month before. Again, nothing that has come down to us from Epictetus was written by him directly. It is the record of his discourses taken down by his disciple Arrian. In consequence, when Epictetus delivered very similar harangues to different audiences on different occasions, we have the record of each. Seneca finally repeated himself again and again and was conscious of it. He excused himself by remarking that he does but inculcate over and over the same counsels to those that over and over commit the same faults. So selections seem to the present editors both necessary and desirable, not only greatly to reduce repetition or to minimize obscurities, but in order to concentrate on what is most representative or most memorable. Of course, there is no way of selecting the best objectively. Selection must necessarily depend to a large extent on the judgment and taste of the editors. And with so much richness to choose from, many decisions on what to put in or leave out had to be arbitrary. We can only plead that we have been as conscientious and objective as we know how. We have taken approximately equal selections from Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, but a slightly greater amount from Seneca, to compensate for the comparative inaccessibility of his work and for the previous undeserved neglect into which it has fallen. The three great Stoics came from astonishingly different backgrounds. Seneca, c. 4 BC to AD 65, was a Spaniard who was brought to Rome at an early age. He studied rhetoric and philosophy and soon gained a reputation at the bar. He was banished in AD 41 by the Emperor Claudius, but recalled 8 years later by Agrippina to become tutor to her son Domitius, afterwards the Emperor Nero, then 11 years old. When Nero came to the throne at 17, Seneca's power was still further increased. Though a Stoic, professedly despising riches, he amassed a huge fortune. This was probably a mistake. His presence in time became irksome to Nero, and his enormous wealth excited his cupidity. Finally, in AD 65, Nero charged Seneca with complicity in a conspiracy against him and ordered him to commit suicide. Tacitus describes the scene. Undismayed, he asked for tablets to make his will. When this was refused by the centurion, he turned to his friends and said that, since he was prevented from rewarding their services, he would leave them the only thing, and yet the best thing, that he had to leave, the pattern of his life. At the same time, he reminded his weeping friends of their duty to be strong, asking them what had become of the precepts of wisdom, of the philosophy which for so many years they had studied in the face of impending evils. Then he embraced his wife and slit his wrists. He was very prolific and wrote altogether the equivalent of more than 20 volumes, including, in addition to his essays on practical ethics and other works on philosophy, 9 tragedies, many satires and epigrams, and books on natural science, astronomy, and meteorology. Little is known about Epictetus. There is no agreement even about the years of his birth or death. The first has been set by various writers anywhere between AD 50 and 60, and the second between AD 100 and 135. He was probably from Hierapolis in Phrygia. As a boy, he was a slave in Rome in the house of Epaphroditus, a favorite of Nero's. On receiving his freedom, he became a professor of philosophy, which he had learned from attending the lectures of the Stoic Musonius Rufus. He taught at Rome, but was expelled with other philosophers by Domitian in AD 90, and then went to Nicopolis in Epirus, where he appears to have spent the rest of his life. He was lame, weak, and chronically poor. A story has it that one day his master started to twist his leg. Epictetus, smiling, told him, "If you go on, you will break my leg." This happened, and Epictetus continued, just as calmly, "Did I not tell you that you would break my leg?" Whether this actually happened, we do not know, but it would be fully in accord with what we do know of the philosopher's character. Epictetus wrote nothing. His teaching was transmitted by a pupil, Arrian, who recorded his discourses and compiled the short manual, the Enchiridion. Marcus Aurelius, AD 121 to 180, was at the other end of the social scale. He was the adopted son of the Emperor Antoninus Pius. He was privately educated but abandoned the study of literature for that of philosophy and law, under the Stoics Rusticus and Moesianus. He became emperor in AD 161, but his reign from the beginning was a tragically unlucky one, and he was forced to spend most of his time fighting frontier wars, putting down insurrections, and combating the effects of plague and demoralization. Notwithstanding all this, he found time to write his famous Meditations. There has been much dispute among critics as to which of the 3 great Stoics was the best writer, but most present-day readers will be content to relish their variety. Seneca has the most copious vocabulary, is the richest in aphorisms, writes the most finished prose, and appeals by his strong and consistent common sense. Epictetus, as transcribed by Arrian, is the wittiest and most humorous, but also the most harshly uncompromising. And while he always keeps his reader awake, he also tends to put him off by his apparent coldness. Marcus lacks some of the gifts of either of his predecessors, but writes with a nobility and sincerity that has few equals in the whole realm of literature. Though Stoicism expounded an elaborate cosmology, it was essentially a guide to the conduct of life. Man should live in accordance with nature. By this the Stoics meant not at all, however, that he should yield to his bodily appetites, but that he should be ruled by reason. The highest good was the virtuous life. Virtue alone is happiness. Virtue is its own sufficient reward, and vice its own punishment. Good must be found by every man within himself. All outward things that are commonly regarded as good or bad, such as wealth and poverty, pleasure and pain, health and sickness, are matters of indifferences to the true Stoic. He can be as happy stretched upon a rack as reposing on a bed of roses. The Stoics made a sharp distinction between things that are in our power and things that are not. Desire and dislike, opinion and affection are within the power of the will. Health, wealth, position, reputation, and the like are commonly not. The Stoics strongly insisted on the unity of the universe and on man's duty as part of a great whole. They were the first to preach cosmopolitanism. There is no difference between Greeks and barbarians. The world is our city. They were also apparently the first who pronounced positive beneficence a virtue. Love of one's neighbor, for example, was enjoined by Marcus Aurelius. The Stoics deeply influenced the later morality of Christianity. The three great Stoics represented here preached essentially the same doctrines, though colored by their individual experience and temperaments. In comparison with the two others, the wealthy Seneca expounded only a modified Stoicism, with a much greater admixture of worldly wisdom. Yet it was he who reminded his readers, "If what you have seems insufficient to you, then, though you possess the world, you will yet be miserable." And he tells us also that the sum of human duty is patience, where we are to suffer, and prudence in the things we do. When we come to Epictetus, there is no compromise with worldliness. Let death and exile be daily before your eyes. Better to die in hunger, exempt from grief and fear, than to live in affluence with perturbation. Marcus is not as unfeeling as Epictetus sometimes appears to be, yet such consolation as he offers must be bought at a high price. Let it make no difference to thee whether thou art cold or warm, if thou art doing thy duty. He even tells himself at one point, "Do not then consider life a thing of any value." These quotations, we must add in fairness, give far too grim an impression of the bulk of the writings of the Stoics, most of whose advice on the conduct of life is not widely different from that given to this day by many non-Stoic philosophers. But the quotations do point to an apparent contradiction in the Stoic system. If we are to take literally its contentions that happiness as ordinarily understood is not necessary, and pain no evil, what is the point in morality or in any human striving whatever? For many modern readers, in fact, it may be hard to see what there was in the doctrines of Stoicism to attract adherents. Epicureans were told they could look for pleasure or at least tranquility in the present life. Rationalists could recognize that if they refrained from overindulgence in their physical appetites, they could probably enjoy better health and longer life, and that peaceful cooperation with others would bring great benefits to themselves as well as to their fellow men. Christians were promised at least future rewards for goodness or future punishment for sins. But the Stoic was told only that the reward of virtue was that of being virtuous. Yet Stoicism did in fact appeal to the noblest among the ancients, and it has held that appeal for more than 2,000 years. It is one of the permanent philosophies of life. In fact, it is still an indispensable element in any rational philosophy. For all men must eventually face death, and before that, the loss of loved ones, and nearly all, no matter how prudently or wisely they try to manage their lives, must at some time suffer disappointment, hardship, accident, defeat, ingratitude, rejection, affronts, humiliation, pain, and even periods of agony. There will always be times when men have need for patience, endurance, and fortitude. These are the great virtues that the Stoic philosophy instills. And when men need these virtues most, they will want to turn to the calm wisdom of Seneca, to the stern admonishments of Epictetus, or to the lofty serenity. A note on the sources of the excerpts. The selections from Seneca are taken from the 17th century translation by Sir Roger L. One Strange, was published in Burt's Home Library series in the early 1900s. It is hard to believe that this translation was not modernized by someone sometime along the way, for it is amazingly smooth and clear. For Epictetus, we have chosen the Elizabeth Carter translation of 1758 as still the most satisfactory. In addition to the numerous short excerpts, we have taken the whole of the Enchiridion, as this seems to have been specifically designed as a summary of his philosophy. For Marcus Aurelius, we have for the most part used the George Long translation of 1862, though in just a few passages we have returned to the old miraclesuccessuk text of 1634, where we thought it clearer or more colorful. In the selections from both Epictetus and Marcus, we have retained the same book numeration as in the full editions, but for the individual thoughts the selected numbering is our own and has been adopted purely for convenience and reference. There is not anything in this world, perhaps, that is more talked of and less understood than the business of a happy life. It is every man's wish and design, and yet not one of 1,000 that knows wherein that happiness consists. We live, however, in a blind and eager pursuit of it, and the more haste we make in a wrong way, the further we are from our journey's end. Let us therefore first consider what it is we should be at, and secondly, which is the readiest way to compass it. If we be right, we shall find every day how much we improve. But if we either follow the cry or the track of people that are out of the way, we must expect to be misled and to continue our days in wandering and error. Wherefore, it highly concerns us to take along with us a skillful guide. For it is not in this as in other voyages, where the highway brings us to our place of repose, or if a man should happen to be out, where the inhabitants might set him right again. But on the contrary, the beaten road is here the most dangerous, and the people, instead of helping us, misguide us. Let us therefore not follow like beasts, but rather govern ourselves by reason than by example. It fares with us in human life as in a routed army. One stumbles first and then another falls upon him, and so they follow, one upon the neck of another, until the whole field comes to be but one heap of miscarriages. And the mischief is that the number of the multitude carries it against truth and justice, so that we must leave the crowd if we would be happy. For the question of a happy life is not to be decided by vote, nay, so far from it, that plurality of voices is still an argument of the wrong. The common people find it easier to believe than to judge, and content themselves with what is usual, never examining whether it is good or not. By the common people is intended the man of title as well as the clouted shoe. For I do not distinguish them by the eye, but by the mind, which is the proper judge of the man. Worldly felicity, I know, makes the head giddy, but if ever a man comes to himself again, he will confess that whatsoever he has done, he wishes undone, and that the things he feared were better than those he prayed for. The true felicity of life is to be free from perturbations, to understand our duties toward God and man, to enjoy the present without any anxious dependence upon the future, not to amuse ourselves with either hopes or fears, but to rest satisfied with what we have, which is abundantly sufficient, for he, that is, so wants nothing. The great blessings of mankind are within use and within our reach, but we shut our eyes and, like people in the dark, we fall foul upon the very thing we search for without finding it. Tranquility is a certain equality of mind, which no condition of fortune can either exalt or depress. Nothing can make it less, for it is the state of human perfection. It raises us as high as we can go, and makes every man his own supporter. Whereas he that is borne up by anything else may fall, he that judges aright and perseveres in it, enjoys a perpetual calm. He takes a true prospect of things. He observes an order, measure, a decorum in all his actions. He has a benevolence in his nature, He squares his life in accordance with reason, and draws to himself love and admiration. But he that always wills or nils the same things is undoubtedly in the right. Liberty and serenity of mind must necessarily ensue upon the mastering of those things which either allure or affright us when, instead of those flashy pleasures, which even at the best are both vain and hurtful together, we shall find ourselves possessed of joy transporting and everlasting. It must be a sound mind that makes a happy man. There must be a constancy in all conditions, a care for the things of this world but without trouble, and such an indifferency for the bounties of fortune, that either with them or without them, we may live contentedly. There must be neither lamentation, nor quarreling, nor sloth, nor fear, for it makes a discord in a man's life. He that fears, serves. The joy of a wise man stands firm without interruption. In all places, at all times, and in all conditions, his thoughts are cheerful and quiet. As it never came into him from without, so it will never leave him, but it is born within him and inseparable from him. It is a solicitous life that is egged on with the hope of anything, though never so open and easy, nay, though a man should never suffer any sort of disappointment. I do not speak this either as a bar to the fair enjoyment of lawful pleasures, or to the gentle flatteries of reasonable expectations, but on the contrary, I would have men to be always in good humor, provided that it arises from their own souls, and be cherished in their own breasts. Other delights are trivial. They may smooth the brow, but they do not fill and affect the heart. True joy is a serene and sober motion, and they are miserably out that take laughing for rejoicing. The seat of it is within, and there is no cheerfulness like the resolution of a brave mind that has fortune under his feet. He that can look death in the face and bid it welcome, open his door to poverty, and bridle his appetites. This is the man whom Providence has established in the possession of inviolable delights. The pleasures of the vulgar are ungrounded, thin, and superficial, but the other are solid and eternal. As the body itself is rather a necessary thing than a great, so the comforts of it are but temporary and vain. Besides that, without extraordinary moderation, their end is only pain and repentance. Whereas a peaceful conscience, honest thoughts, virtuous actions, and an indifference for casual events are blessings without end, satiety, or measure. This consummated state of felicity is only a submission to the dictate of right nature. The foundation of it is wisdom and virtue, the knowledge of what we ought to do, and the conformity of the will to that knowledge. Happiness founded upon wisdom. Taking for granted that human happiness is founded upon wisdom and virtue, we shall treat of these 2 points in order as they lie. And first, of wisdom, not in the latitude of its various operations, but as it has only a regard to a good life and the happiness of mankind. Wisdom is a right understanding, a faculty of discerning good from evil, what is to be chosen and what rejected, a judgment grounded upon the value of things, and not the common opinion of them, an equality of force, and a strength of resolution. It sets a watch over our words and deeds. It takes us up with the contemplation of the works of nature, and makes us invincible by either good or evil fortune. It is large and spacious, and requires a great deal of room to work in. It ransacks heaven and earth. It has for its object things past and to come, transitory and eternal. It examines all the circumstances of time, what it is, when it began, and how long it will continue. And so for the mind, whence it came, what it is, when it begins, how long it lasts, whether or not it passes from one form to another, or serves only one, and wanders when it leaves us, whether it abides in a state of separation, and what the action of it, what use it makes of its liberty, whether or not it retains the memory of things past and comes to the knowledge of itself. To be wise is the use of wisdom, as seeing is the use of eyes, and well-speaking the use of eloquence. He that is perfectly wise is perfectly happy. Nay, the very beginning of wisdom makes life easy to us. Neither is it enough to know this, unless we print it in our minds by daily meditation, and so bring a good will to a good habit. And we must practice what we preach. For philosophy is not a subject for popular ostentation, nor does it rest in words, but in things. It is not an entertainment taken up for delight, or to give a taste to our leisure, but it fashions the mind, governs our actions, tells us what we are to do and what not. It sits at the helm, and guides us through all hazards. Nay, we cannot be safe without it, for every hour gives us occasion to make use of it. It informs us in all the duties of life, piety to our parents, faith to our friends, charity to the miserable, judgment in counsel. It gives us peace by fearing nothing, and riches by coveting nothing. There is no condition of life that excludes a wise man from discharging his duty. If his fortune be good, he tempers it. If bad, he masters it. If he has an estate, he will exercise his virtue in plenty. If none, in poverty. If he cannot do it in his country, he will do it in banishment. If he has no command, he will do the office of a common soldier. Wisdom does not teach our fingers but our minds. Fiddling and dancing, arms and fortifications, were the works of luxury and discord. But wisdom instructs us in the way of nature, and in the arts of utility and concord, not in the instruments, but in the government of life. Not to make us live only, but to live happily. She teaches us what things are good, what evil, and what only appear so, and to distinguish betwixt true greatness and tumor. She clears our minds of dross and vanity. She raises up our thoughts to heaven, and carries them down to hell. She discourses of the nature of the soul, the powers and faculties of it, the first principles of things, the order of providence. She exalts us from things corporeal to things incorporeal, and retrieves the truth of all. She searches nature, gives laws to life, and tells us that it is not enough to know God unless we obey Him. She looks upon all accidents as acts of providence, sets a true value upon things, delivers us from false opinions, and condemns all pleasures that are attended with repentance. She allows nothing to be good that will not be so forever, no man to be happy, but he that needs no other happiness than what he has within himself. No man to be great or powerful that is not master of himself. This is the felicity of human life, a felicity that can neither be corrupted nor extinguished. It inquires into the nature of the heavens, the influence of the stars, how far they operate upon our minds and bodies, which thoughts, though they do not form our manners, they do yet raise and dispose us for glorious things. It is agreed upon at all hands that right reason is the perfection of human nature, and wisdom only the dictate of it. The greatness that arises from it is solid and unmovable, the resolutions of wisdom being free, absolute, and constant, whereas folly is never long pleased with the same thing, but still shifting of counsels, and sick of itself. There can be no happiness without constancy and prudence. He that demurs and hesitates is not yet composed, but wherever virtue interposes upon the main, there must be concord and consent in the parts, for all virtues are in agreement, as well as all vices are at variance. A wise man, in what condition soever he is, will be still happy, for he subjects all things to himself because he submits himself to reason and governs his actions by counsel, not by passion. He is not moved with the utmost violences of fortune, nor with the extremities of fire and sword, whereas a fool is afraid of his own shadow and surprised at ill accidents, as if they were all leveled at him. He does nothing unwillingly, for whatever he finds necessary, he makes it his choice. He propounds to himself the certain scope and end of human life. He follows that which conduces to it, and avoids that which hinders it. He is content with his lot, whatever it be, without wishing what he has not, though of the two he had rather abound than want.
The great business of his life, like that of nature, is performed without tumult or noise. He neither fears danger nor provokes it, but it is his caution, not any want of courage. For captivity, wounds, and chains he only looks upon as false and lymphatical terrors. He does not pretend to go through with whatever he undertakes, but to do that well which he does. Arts are but the servants, wisdom commands, and where the matter fails, It is none of the workman's fault. He is cautious in doubtful cases, in prosperity temperate, and resolute in adversity, still making the best of every condition and improving all occasions to make them serviceable to his fate. Some accidents there are which, I confess, may affect him, but not overthrow him, as bodily pains, loss of children and friends, the ruin and desolation of a man's country. One must be made of stone or iron, not to be sensible of these calamities, and besides, it were no virtue to bear them, if a body did not feel them. There are 3 degrees of proficience in the school of wisdom. The first are those that come within sight of it, but not up to it. They have learned what they ought to do, but they have not put their knowledge in practice. They are past the hazard of a relapse, but they have still the grudges of a disease, though they are out of the danger of it. By a disease, I do understand an obstinacy in evil or an ill habit that makes us overeager upon things which are either not much to be desired or not at all. A second sort are those that have subjected their appetites for a season, but are yet in fear of falling back. A third sort are those that are clear of many vices, but not of all. They are not covetous, but perhaps they are choleric, not lustful, but perchance ambitious. They are firm enough in some cases, but weak in others. There are many that despise death and yet shrink at pain.
There are diversities in wise men, but no inequalities. One is more affable, another more ready, a third a better speaker. But the felicity of them all is equal. It is in this, as in heavenly bodies, there is a certain state in greatness. In civil and domestic affairs, a wise man may stand in need of counsel, as of a physician, an advocate, a solicitor, but in greater matters the blessing of wise men rests in the joy they take in the communication of their virtues. If there were nothing else in it, a man would resupply himself of wisdom, because it settles him in a perpetual tranquility of mind. Happiness founded upon virtue. Virtue is that perfect good, which is the complement of a happy life. The only immortal thing that belongs to mortality. It is the knowledge both of others and itself. It is an invincible greatness of mind, not to be elevated nor dejected with good or ill fortune. It is sociable and gentle, free, steady, and fearless, content within itself, full of inexhaustible delights, and it is valued for itself. One may be a good physician, a good grammarian, without being a good man, so that all things from without are only accessories. For the seat of it is a pure and holy mind. It consists of a congruity of actions which we can never expect so long as we are distracted by our passions. Not but that a man may be allowed to change color and countenance, and suffer such impressions as are properly a kind of natural force upon the body, and not under the dominion of the mind. But all this while I will have his judgment firm, and he shall act steadily and boldly, without wavering betwixt the motions of his body and those of his mind. It is not a thing indifferent, I know, whether a man lie at ease upon a bed, or in a torment upon a wheel, and yet the former may be the worse of the two, if he suffers the latter with honor, and enjoys the other with infamy. It is not the matter but the virtue that makes the action good or ill, and he that is led in triumph may be yet greater than his conqueror. When we come once to value our flesh above our honesty, we are lost, and yet I would not press upon dangers, no, not so much as upon inconveniences, unless where the man and the brute come in competition. And in such case, rather than make a forfeiture of my credit, my reason or my faith, I would run all extremities. They are great blessings to have tender parents, dutiful children, and to live under a just and well-ordered government. Now, would it not? He that robs upon the highway had rather find his booty than force it. Ask any of them that live upon rapine, fraud, oppression, if they had not rather enjoy a fortune honestly gotten, and their consciences will not suffer them to deny it. Men are vicious only for the profit of villainy, for at the same time they commit it, they condemn it. Nay, so powerful is virtue, and so gracious is providence, that every man has a light set up within him for a guide, which we do all of us see and acknowledge, though we do not pursue it. This is it that makes the prisoner upon the torture happier than the executioner, and sickness better than health, if we bear it without yielding or repining. This is it that overcomes ill fortune and moderates good, for it marches betwixt the one and the other with an equal contempt of both. It turns like fire all things into itself. Our actions and our friendships are tinctured with it, and whatever it touches becomes amiable. That which is frail and mortal rises and falls, grows, wastes, and varies from itself. But the state of things divine is always the same, and so is virtue. Let the matter be what it will. It is never the worse for the difficulty of the action nor the better for the easiness of it. It is the same in a rich man as in a poor, in a sickly man as in a sound, in a strong as in a weak. The virtue of the besieged is as great as that of the besiegers. There are some virtues, I confess, which a good man cannot be without, and yet he had rather have no occasion to employ them. If there were any difference, I should prefer the virtues of patience before those of pleasure, for it is braver to break through difficulties than to temper our delights. But though the subject of virtue may possibly be against nature, as to be burnt or wounded, yet the virtue itself of an invincible patience is according to nature. We may seem, perhaps, to promise more than human nature is able to perform, but we speak with respect to the mind and not to the body.